Good morning, world. Good morning, excrement on the ground that should not be on the trail but happens to be there. Sometimes shit just gonna be in your way. Ha ha ha, what a bar. So, yes, it's a lovely Friday morning. First Friday of September. Got a nice little crisp and chill in the air, and that's a really kind of unfamiliar feeling for North Carolina. Usually it's like super hot during September, like it really still feels like summer, and it's actually been a little bit more chill and cool these last couple days as we've been transitioning, which is odd, yes, but equally refreshing. So we celebrate that. And let's see, I'm in school, which means that like we get to focus on really specific topics here. I get to journal and let my mind wander about what I've been learning in class. And this is actually really good because of the fact that I've got a paper due, my first paper due in years. To write an assignment, man, with the intent of like having it read by somebody and like having it evaluated based on like my arguments and my thoughts. A dream to be living in. So very thankful for that. Never thought I'd be so thankful to do a writing assignment in my life, but here we are. And the course is a special topics in anthropology and sociology called Humanitarianism and International Justice. And you'd think that, okay, we're talking about like how these are, great concepts for the world, and international justice is this thing that we absolutely need, but then it gets a little bit more muddied and nuanced when you start to understand like what are the implications that come with humanitarian aid. Like, is it truly all good? Like, and is the intent to do good? Like, where does that come from? Why is humanitarianism a thing in modern times when, it wasn't necessarily like aid giving and charity has always been a thing, but humanitarianism was not like a concept or a belief back in the day. So interesting to think about. Wake us up, rooster, wake us up. So that's the interesting thing to think about is humanitarianism a good, a bad, or is it even deeper than that? And how does that tie into like globalization and international justice and how the world is handling some of the modern things going on? The professor studied and did some field work in South Sudan, which is, I did not know, the newest country in the world since, I want to say 2011, maybe 2012, youngest country in the world. And it came about after, conflict, upheaval, but also stability and order. So all those things come hand in hand. And to this first paper specifically is about these two concepts that relate to humanitarianism. And the two concepts are called Antipolitics, and the second term is the state, or phrase is the state of exception. And there's a lot, but what I have come to understand, always starting with definition, anti-politics is kind of like this theoretical approach that humanitarians can use as a means of justifying their presence and their actions within a community that is not their own. To come into another space, and anti-politics is saying that we are here to focus on development and aid. We are here to provide care in the place that we have identified that care is needed. We may not even know like the full structure of the rest of the world. Also, just look at these colorful berries. I see why the deer be out here. If I was a deer, I'd eat them shits too. Um, but anti-politics is a means of justifying the bypassing of pre-existing political quote-unquote conditions. And I say political as anything that is I think the professor described it as geopolitical. So the example is in South Africa. There is a country within South Africa called Lesotho, and that country is literally encircled by all of South Africa. And because of that, there's obviously some power disparity and inequality, especially when it comes to the work and the labor there. But a report went out once and stated that Lesotho was primarily an agricultural society, which, if you are just an outsider looking in, you would think that based on some of their practices, but only come to realize like why they're not an agricultural and why they're more of a migrant wage labor union or wage labor force is because of the power dynamics that exist between South Africa and them and the mines, which provide wealth and employment to these people that they would normally not get in their own spaces. Wow, those trees grew. Oh my gosh, I remember when y'all were like just saplings. Cute. So anti-politics is a term that the humanitarians will not actively put on themselves. Like, they're not calling themselves anti-political, but it's the mindset that they move with. And anti-politics is what allows and justifies their development of certain things in places. And even if those developments fail or they end up like causing more upheaval and strife, it doesn't matter, because like what probably ended up happening was their implementation of the stuff, as opposed to like them just being misdiagnosing it and being wrong. So anti-politics is kind of like, yeah, it's the means that which humanitarians need in order to justify an intervention, basically. And through said intervention, they can overlook pre-existing issues that might be also causes for why inequalities exist or why there needs to be aid to these people. If you don't do your full research and look at what are all the intersections between this, then you can kind of also just be like a single issue voter and be like, hey, I'm only focused on the one thing, and that's what we came here to do. So in that way, it seems to almost transcend, or as I've been referring into my paper, it creates a null zone. It creates this almost like imaginative space where you get to act outside of human political sphere. And if you were able to act outside of the sphere, you, especially if you can dictate when and how and what you're doing outside of said sphere, and you can always say, hey, this is for the betterment of like a group of people, this is for human rights, this is for, you know, something that is so morally driven that you'd be a heartless person to not let me in when all I'm trying to do is provide aid and protect human rights, because every human born needs their human rights. So through the moral duty, they create the part of that justification as well. In anti-politics, the effect of it is that it can sometimes depoliticize a place. It can, like I said, it can cause more issues. The developments can fail, which they often do. Also, the people who really need the money and the wealth typically don't see it, and instead it goes to, you know, the higher up, and the elite continue to get richer even off of it. And it's wild that like humanitarian aid and development projects become part of, like, it's a new asset in the global economy. And that's kind of twisted and screwed up because specifically a humanitarian intervention requires some sort of natural disaster or human-made disaster. It cannot exist without having that. And this brings us into the second term and concept, which is state of exception. And the state of exception is a phenomenon that has existed since the Roman era, Roman Empire, or Senate at least, and did not become what it is until maybe about like 1789 in France. And what it essentially is the sovereign has the ability to supersede the law in times where they have determined that they need to protect the interests of the sovereign state and the nation and security or people's lives. They'll always put a different tag word on it depending on what it is, but it is a suspension of all the laws that we have agreed upon, and it is both a law in itself and also not a law. Like, it's not written, or I may be written, but like what happens in a state of exception is unwritten. So, and it's kind of up to the means of the sovereign to determine what is going to be the law during a state of exception. And a state of exception requires, no matter what, some sort of emergency of multiple kinds or a potential disturbance. And already you can see the way that could just be misconstrued and manipulated even. Who would want to manipulate those phrases, right? But what it leads into is, if there's a state of exception, I can legally suspend the normal laws and instead create laws as I need to in relation to the emergency that we are navigating. And with that power, it's also another way to transcend the space and enter the null zone where you can do human activities that are outside of the law. And that combination of the two is what gives rise to the intervention. The intervention requires an anti-political principle saying that we are here and we're focusing on the thing, and that's what our agenda is here, even though we are politically attached to other things. That's not what we're here to do. We are here to save lives, and Antipolitics will allow that to be the case. And then secondly, we are here temporarily because there's an emergency and people's lives are at risk. So we are going to invoke a state of exception. And in said state of exception, it's, see, there it is. Finally, I knew it. If y'all thought I was like just tweaking out a little bit, there's just a lot of spider webs on the trail in the morning. And I just ran it. I'd been running into a couple, and I almost ran into this one that still has the spider on it in the middle of the path. So, excuse the web breaking break. Alright, we're good. I don't mind having the web on me as long as the spider's not on me. Anyways, so yes, the state of exception, anti-politics, both are essential and fundamental to the intervention. And through the intervention, humanitarians can justify what they're doing. But also what's happening in today's times is humanitarians being intrinsically almost linked with the military. Because in some ways, the military requires the humanitarians to be present in a place, so that they can, rationalize why they're there. They're there to protect the aid workers, because aid workers are also should be morally protected. Like, an aid worker you should never kill a doctor. Like, those are the things that we as a culture believe. And that can be, again, that can be used in the rhetoric and the narrative of why you would also need a military presence. So you get humanitarians in there who are, some of them truly are passionate about just saving lives. There sometimes the organization, maybe as a whole and not so much like an individual, who want to utilize that as an advantage, and they see these moments of crisis and times as opportunities for them to step in. And through their stepping in to provide aid, to develop, to make investments in a country, especially saying that we're not here to make any investments, but actively making investments, when that happens, like, you start to create an industry where they're part of the global economy now. Like, they're part of the capitalistic system. War has become part of the capitalistic system. War needs to happen perpetually, and it doesn't have to be a big war, but there needs to be continuous war. As I'm quoting George Orwell, like, continuous war needs to be present, so that you're always going to need aid intervention, you're always going to need development, and these places are never going to be fully developed as long as outside foreign powers, who are especially a lot more powerful than said place, is going to be there. And especially now, we're witnessing, like, the shortcomings of we're realizing the shortcomings of institutions like NATO and the United Nations, these international organizations that we were told, like, oh yeah, no, this is the safeguard and measures that protect the whole globe. And in reality, like, they're quiet as fuck, and all they're doing, excuse my language, but they're just quiet. They're not speaking up about the inequalities that are being present. But then you have somebody like Israel who utilizes the existence and the violence that Hamas caused them to justify their intervention, both humanitarian and military. We're here to protect lives. In order to protect lives, we need to enact a state of exception. In order to have a state of exception, we have to believe that we're just focusing on one thing. And this isn't political or not. This is bigger than politics. There's a limit to it. So it's definitely an interesting concept, and what I am excited to continue to revise and write about is how narrative plays an integral role in all of this. Because before you can enact a state of exception, before you can claim an anti-political stance, you have to know what story is being told. What story is the media and the reports saying about these people? What do we believe is their main source of resources? What is their, like, how is the geopolitical sphere operating? What are those effects? What do they do for fun? What do they do for grief? What is their relationship with death? Like, there's so many different questions that can be asked, and there's so many different ideas that can be realized depending on what story you're telling. And how can that story also, like, lead to the inevitable failure of development and further destabilization? And how can you use myths and fiction to justify the invasion of nation states? How can you use fiction to invade a nation? That's the bar. That's the paper. Fiction as a means of invasion.